The village of Nyamuruta was a place of warmth, where the golden sun kissed the earth, and the wind carried the scent of freshly tilled soil. The villagers lived in harmony with nature, their days filled with the hum of laughter, the rhythmic pounding of millet, and the sweet melodies of songs passed down through generations. Majestic baobab trees stood like ancient sentinels, guarding the wisdom of the land, while the river, wide and deep, nourished the fields and provided life to all who depended on it. Every morning the elders gathered beneath the great tree in the village square, sharing stories of the past, while children ran barefoot across the red earth, their voices rising in playful mischief. Among them was Zelira, a young woman whose name was often spoken with admiration. She was the daughter of a revered healer, and though she had inherited her mother's knowledge of herbs and remedies, her true gift lay in her mind. Zelira was sharp, curious, and fiercely independent, traits that often set her apart from other women of her age. She was not content with simply following tradition. She dreamed of exploring, of learning beyond the village, of discovering truths that lay beyond the hills that encircled her home. Yet, despite her ambitions, she carried deep love for her people and honored the traditions that had shaped her. It was on a fateful afternoon, when the sky was painted with hues of amber and lilac, that a stranger arrived in Nyamuruta. His name was Omand, a traveler who seemed to have emerged from the very winds that swept across the grasslands. He was tall and lean, with a cloak draped over his shoulders, embroidered with patterns unfamiliar to the villagers. His voice was smooth, his words carefully chosen, and his presence carried an air of mystery. The moment he set foot in the village, heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd, and curiosity sparked in the hearts of those who watched him. Omand claimed to have traveled from faraway lands, speaking of places where the rivers shimmered like glass and the forests sang at night. He told tales that made the young wide-eyed with wonder and the elders nod with interest. His charisma was undeniable, and soon he was welcomed as an honored guest. The men admired his knowledge, and the women found themselves captivated by his charm. Yet it was Zelira who felt an inexplicable pull towards him, an attraction she could not quite understand. There was a gentleness in the way he spoke to her, a sense of understanding that felt rare. He did not dismiss her dreams or ambitions as others often did. Instead, he listened, asking questions that made her feel seen, as though he had known her long before they had met. And so, despite the unspoken caution lingering at the edges of her mind, Zelira found herself drawn deeper into Omand's presence. But not all who come with charming smiles bring peace, and though the village welcomed Omand with open arms, there was something about him that did not quite fit, something that whispered of secrets buried beneath his composed exterior. And though no one could put words to it just yet, the winds that had carried Omand into Nyamuruta seemed to bring with them an unseen shadow, a presence that, in time, would shake Zelira's world to its core. At first, Omand was nothing more than an intriguing presence in the village, a traveler with charming words and a mysterious past. But soon he became a part of everyday life in Nyamuruta, ingraining himself in the hearts of the people. He was always eager to lend a hand, helping the farmers mend broken tools, carrying heavy bundles for the elderly, and soothing restless children with mesmerizing stories of distant lands. The people, especially the women, were drawn to his smooth voice and confident presence, yet it was Zelira who found herself unable to look away from him. What began as fleeting conversations at the village square soon turned into long walks beneath the moonlit sky. Omand would speak of the wonders he had seen, the golden dunes of the desert, the towering mountains that kissed the sky, the rivers that whispered secrets to those who listened closely. His voice carried the weight of someone who had lived 1,000 lives, yet when Zelira asked about his past, he would grow quiet. "I have seen things I wish to forget," he would say, his gaze turning to the horizon as though searching for something unseen. "Perhaps one day I will tell you, but not today." Zelira did not press him. She saw the sorrow that flickered in his eyes, and it softened her heart toward him. She believed he had suffered, that he carried burdens too heavy to share, and so she told herself that love required patience. In time he would open his heart to her and she would be there to ease his pain. As the days turned into weeks, Zelira and Omand became inseparable. The villagers whispered about them, amused by the way she laughed more freely in his presence, how her once cautious heart had softened toward this enigmatic traveler. Her mother, though loving, watched with quiet concern, and the elders in the village soon took notice. One evening, as the fire crackled and the stars shimmered above, the village elders called Zelira to sit with them. The oldest among them, Baba Jango, studied her with wise, knowing eyes. "Child," he said, his voice steady like the river's flow, "we see how your heart leans toward this man, but be wary. A tree does not bear fruit overnight. Love must be tested by seasons before you call it true. Zelira listened respectfully, but deep inside she did not want to hear their warnings. Omand was unlike anyone she had ever met. He understood her, he saw her dreams, and he made her feel as though she could be more than what tradition dictated. "But Baba," she said gently, "how can I turn away from what my heart tells me is true?" The elder sighed. "The heart is like a river, it follows the easiest path but not always the right one." Despite their words, Zelira chose to follow her own path. She believed that love was meant to be grasped, not measured like the turning of the seasons. One night, beneath the glow of the full moon, Omand held her hands in his gaze filled with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. "Zelira," he whispered, "you are unlike anyone I have ever known. I feel as though I was meant to find you." Her heart raced. "Then why do you still hide your past from me?" Omand tensed, his jaw tightening for a moment before he spoke. "Because some truths bring more pain than peace," he said softly. "I do not want my past to taint what we have." Zelira desperately wanted to believe him, so she nodded, reassuring herself that in time, love would melt away the walls he had built around himself. And so night after night she listened to his voice, to his stories, to the soft promises he wove into her heart. She began to dream of a life beside him, of building a future together, of laughter and children and love that endured beyond the setting sun. But dreams are fragile things, and Zelira had yet to learn that even the sweetest whispers can mask the darkest of truths. At first, everything seemed perfect. Zelira was convinced she had found a love unlike any other, and the village had grown accustomed to Omand's presence. Yet, small, unsettling things began to happen, things that no one could explain. It started with the animals. Goats and chickens went missing in the dead of night, their owners waking to find their enclosures broken open, as if by some unseen force. The hunters, skilled in tracking, found no footprints leading away from the pens, only deep claw marks in the earth, the kind that did not belong to any creature known to them. Whispers of bad omens spread through the village, but no one dared to say it aloud. Then came the shadows. Some villagers swore they saw dark shapes moving just beyond the light of their fires, flickering figures that disappeared when looked at directly. The elders muttered of spirits that roamed the land when they were not appeased, but they had performed all the necessary rituals. What, then, had they done to invite such unrest? Zelira noticed something else. Omand had changed. He still spoke sweetly to her, still held her as though she was the most precious thing in the world, but there was a restlessness in him now, a tension that had not been there before. He would disappear at odd hours, always with an excuse, always just before the darkness fell too thickly upon the land. One night, Zelira could not sleep. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with something unspoken. She turned in her bed, listening to the night sounds, the chirping insects, the occasional hoot of an owl. Then she realized something was missing. The village dogs who always barked at unseen things were silent. She rose quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The village lay in eerie stillness, but in the distance, near the line of trees, a figure moved. Omand. Zelira frowned. Where was he going at this hour? Without thinking, she followed, keeping to the shadows as he strode toward the forest's edge. She watched as he stopped beneath the branches of a great tree, his form half hidden in the darkness. And then, he spoke. Not to himself. Not in the way a person mumbles thoughts aloud. No, his voice was low and urgent, his words slipping into a tongue Zelira had never heard before. The air around him seemed to hum, thick with something unnatural. She took a step closer, her heart pounding. What was he saying? Who was he speaking to? Before she could move any further, Omand's head snapped up. Zelira. His voice was calm, but there was something in it that sent chills racing down her spine. He stepped forward into the moonlight, his face unreadable. You shouldn't be here, he said, reaching for her hand. Zelira swallowed. Who were you talking to? Omand gave a soft chuckle, one that did not quite reach his eyes. No one, my love. I was only thinking aloud. But Zelira knew what she had seen. Still she said nothing. She let him lead her back to the village, forcing herself to believe his words, forcing herself to ignore the unease that clawed at the back of her mind. The next morning the elders gathered in the square, their faces tight with concern. Baba Jango had spoken of a terrifying dream, one that had shaken him so deeply that he could not ignore it. I saw a dark shadow, he said, his voice grave. It walked among us, wearing the face of a man, but its heart was not of this world. It seeks something, and if we do not stop it, we will all suffer. The villagers murmured uneasily, glancing at one another. Bad dreams were not uncommon, but Baba Jango's dreams had always been warnings. Zalaira felt her stomach twist. The elder turned to her, his gaze piercing. "Child," he said, "be careful of the company you keep." She knew what he was implying. But she could not, would not, believe it. Omand had been nothing but kind to her. Yes, strange things had happened, but that did not mean he was responsible. Did it? She shook her head, offering a reassuring smile. "Baba, Omand has done nothing wrong. He is a good man." Baba Jango studied her for a long moment before sighing. "The river does not warn of a flood until the waters are at its edge," he said. "Be careful that you do not drown." The words unsettled her, but still she clung to her trust in Omand. Yet the unease only grew. Omand became more possessive, more watchful. He no longer liked her speaking with certain people, especially the elders. When she spoke of her doubts, he would smile, but his fingers tightened around hers just a little too much. "Do you not trust me, Zalaira?" he asked one evening, his voice low. "Of course I do," she said, though the words felt heavier than before. Then came the final sign, the one that sent the whispers through the village into something more than just unease. A child, no older than 7, came running into the square one afternoon, his face pale with fear. He pointed toward the forest, his small body trembling. "I saw him," he cried. "I saw a man talking to something that had no face." The villagers gasped, turning toward Zalaira. She forced out a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to her ears. "He's just a child," she said. "Children see things that are not there." But the boy shook his head furiously. "No, it was real. It stood in the shadows, and Omand spoke to it like he knew it." Silence fell. The air grew thick with unspoken words, with doubt. Zalaira turned to find Omand standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. And for the first time since she had met him, she felt afraid. Zalaira could no longer ignore the unease that had settled in her heart like a stone. The whispers in the village, the eerie occurrences, the way Omand's grip had tightened around her life, it all pointed to something she could not explain. But the moment the child claimed to have seen Omand speaking to something that had no face, a cold certainty took root in her. She had to know the truth. That night she waited. Omand had grown restless in the past few days, often slipping away under the cover of darkness. She had asked him once where he went, and he had simply smiled, brushing her hair from her face. "Some things are better left unknown, my love." But she could no longer accept that. So, when he rose from his sleeping mat and moved silently through the village, Zalaira followed. She kept her steps light, her breath shallow, moving like a shadow through the familiar paths of the village. Omand did not glance back. He was focused, walking with purpose, his cloak billowing behind him as though caught in a wind that did not touch the trees. He headed toward the forest, the place where she had seen him whispering before. Zalaira hesitated at the edge of the trees, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could turn back. She could pretend she had never followed him. But the doubt had taken root too deep, and so she stepped forward. The deeper she went, the more the air changed. The familiar sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, the rustling of leaves, faded into silence. Even the wind held its breath. Then she heard it. A voice. Low, guttural, ancient. It was Omand's voice, but it was not like anything she had ever heard before. It was layered, like two voices speaking at once, one human, the other something else entirely. Zalaira crouched behind a thick tree trunk, peering into the clearing beyond. And what she saw made her blood turn to ice. Omand stood at the center of a circle of stones, his arms outstretched, his head tilted back. The ground inside the circle pulsed with an eerie glow, shifting like a living thing. Strange symbols had been drawn into the dirt, symbols that seemed to writhe if she looked at them too long. Then the air rippled. Something stepped out of the darkness. At first it was just a shadow, a twisting, shifting thing that had no true form. But as it moved, it began to take shape. A tall, gaunt figure with elongated limbs and a face that was both there and not there, flickering like a flame. Zalaira clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. The creature, for it was no man, spoke, its voice a whisper that slithered through the air like smoke. "Time is running out, Omand." Omand did not flinch. His face was calm, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a flicker of something. Fear? "I need more time," Omand said, his voice no longer charming, no longer smooth. It was raw, almost desperate. The spirit's laughter was a dry, grating thing. "More time? You are bound by the pact, trickster. You have played your game well, but your final task must be completed." Zalaira pressed herself against the tree, her entire body trembling. Trickster? Pact? Final task? What had she stumbled into? The creature leaned closer, its flickering face inches from Oman's. You made your choice when you wore this form, when you took on the face of a man. But you cannot outrun what you are. Oman's hands clenched into fists. I am not ready. The creature's voice grew sharper. It is not your readiness that matters. Fulfill the pact or be consumed. For the first time, Oman looked afraid. Zelira could not stay silent any longer. Her entire world had just shattered. She stepped forward before she could think, her voice breaking. What are you? Oman's head snapped toward her. Shock flashed across his face, then something darker. Zelira, he said, stepping toward her, his voice softer now, pleading. You shouldn't be here. She took a step back. What are you? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Oman's mouth opened, but before he could speak, the creature turned its shifting gaze on her. Ah, it hissed. She does not know. Zelira's blood turned cold. Tell her, Oman. Tell her what you really are. Oman's expression twisted. His entire form shuddered, and for the briefest moment he was no longer a man. His shape blurred, like a reflection in disturbed water. His limbs lengthened, his features flickered between the Oman she knew and something else, something inhuman. Zelira's breath caught. The man she had trusted, the man she had dreamed of a future with, was not a man at all. Oman reached for her, his form stabilizing, returning to the face she had loved. Zelira, please. But she was already moving. She turned and ran. The forest was a blur around her, branches clawing at her skin, roots threatening to pull her down. She could hear Oman calling after her, hear his footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. Zelira, wait. But she could not wait. Her heart thundered in her chest, her breath came in ragged gasps. The man she had loved was a lie. A trickster. A creature bound by some dark pact. The village was close now. The warm glow of the fires flickered through the trees, a beacon of safety. Just as she reached the edge of the forest, Oman's voice rang out, desperate, raw. Zelira, if you leave now, you will never know the full truth. She stopped just for a second. Then she ran. Zelira burst into the village, her breath ragged, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted toward the main square. The moment she emerged from the darkness of the forest, several villagers turned, startled by her disheveled appearance. Some murmured among themselves, while others stepped forward with concern. Zelira? Mama Ao called, stepping toward her. What happened, child? She could barely form the words. Her world had shattered, and now she had to make them see. It's Oman, she gasped, doubling over to catch her breath. He's not who he says he is. He's a trickster. A monster. The villagers froze. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but no one spoke aloud. Then a familiar voice rang out, smooth, composed, too composed. Zelira, my love, you wound me. The crowd parted and there he was. Oman stood in the center of the village, looking as calm as ever. His deep brown eyes shimmered with something unreadable, his hands open in a gesture of innocence. He was not afraid, not even slightly. Why do you say these things? He asked, his voice filled with quiet sorrow. After everything we've shared, why would you turn against me? Zelira's stomach twisted. He was doing it again, weaving his words like a net, pulling them into his deception. Don't listen to him, she shouted, pointing an accusing finger at him. I saw him. I saw what he is. A few villagers exchanged uneasy glances, but some had already begun shaking their heads, their trust in Oman unshaken. Zelira, are you feeling well? One of the women asked hesitantly. Perhaps you should rest. Zelira couldn't believe it. Even after everything, they still believed him. Oman took a step forward, his expression carefully controlled, his voice laced with gentle concern. My love, I know the elders' words have frightened you. I know there are strange things happening, but you must not let fear cloud your heart. He reached out a hand. Come with me and we will talk. Just the two of us. Zelira stiffened. No, this was a trap. She took a step back, shaking her head violently. No, don't touch me. I know what I saw. She turned desperately to the elders, searching for even one face that believed her. And then, finally, Baba Jango stepped forward. Enough, the old man said, his voice strong despite his age. His gaze was sharp as he studied Oman, his lined face unreadable. Child, he said to Zelira, tell me exactly what you saw. She swallowed hard and spoke the truth. She told them everything, the ritual, the strange markings on the ground, the shadowed spirit that had spoken to Oman, the moment his face had flickered between that of a man and something inhuman. The village listened, but it was not until she described the spirit's warning, the final task Oman had yet to complete, that the mood in the square shifted. Some of the elders exchanged nervous glances. "This is not the first time we have seen such things," Baba Jango murmured. "Wait, what do you mean?" Zalaira asked, hope flickering in her chest. Mama Ao, usually warm and gentle, now looked grim. "Years ago there was another man who came to our village just as Oman did. He was charming, helpful. But soon people started to vanish. One by one until he too disappeared, leaving only his shadow behind." Zalaira's pulse pounded. It had happened before. At last doubt spread through the crowd. The whispers turned to uneasy murmurs, people stepping away from Oman. His control was slipping. Oman's face hardened, but still he did not panic. He had one last move to play. "I have done nothing wrong," he said smoothly. "You take the word of a frightened woman over the kindness I have shown you all? I have helped this village. I have worked beside you. Have I not earned your trust?" A few villagers hesitated. He was still winning them over. And then, the shaman arrived. The villagers gasped as the old man stepped into the square. He was not from their village, but all knew of Shango, the wandering shaman who walked between villages, sensing the unseen, cleansing the cursed. His long robes were lined with bones and beads, his staff carved with ancient symbols. "I felt it," Shango said, his voice like the rustling of old leaves. "An evil presence lingers here." Oman finally stiffened. It was the first sign of true unease he had shown. Shango turned to him, his old eyes peering deep, deep into him. "Show us your true face, trickster." The village held its breath. For the first time Oman did not speak. The silence stretched. Then suddenly, he moved. Oman's body jerked unnaturally, his limbs twitching, his form flickering like a flame in the wind. A horrifying guttural sound tore from his throat, something that was neither human nor beast. And then, his skin rippled. Gasps filled the air as Oman's shape melted like wax, his body stretching, distorting. His once handsome face twisted into something unnatural, his eyes turning hollow and black, his mouth stretching too wide, lined with jagged, glistening teeth. Screams rang through the village. Oman was no man at all. The villagers scattered in panic, mothers pulling their children away, men reaching for spears that they knew would do no good against something like this. Oman let out a furious, inhuman screech, his flickering form twisting as though struggling to hold its shape. But the shaman was already moving. Shango drove his staff into the ground, chanting words older than the village itself. The earth shook beneath them, the air crackling with energy as symbols burned into the dirt around Oman's shifting body. The monster that had once been Oman howled, its form writhing, lashing out as tendrils of dark energy tried to escape, but the shaman's magic held firm. "You will not take another soul," Shango intoned, his voice echoing like thunder. Oman screamed. And the battle for his fate had begun. The village erupted into chaos, the once peaceful night now filled with terrified screams and the flickering glow of torches. Oman's true form loomed over them, a grotesque shadow that shifted and flickered, its shape constantly twisting between human and something much, much worse. His eyes were pits of endless darkness and his mouth, now lined with jagged teeth, curled into a terrifying grin. The shaman, Shango, stood firm, his gnarled hands gripping his staff as he chanted the first words of an ancient incantation. His voice was low and steady at first, like a distant rumble of thunder, but as he spoke, the air grew heavy, charged with unseen power. "Do not let him escape," Baba Jango called, rallying the villagers. "We must stand together." Many villagers hesitated, fear gripping their hearts. How could they possibly fight against something like this? But Mama Ao, the village healer, stepped forward, dipping her hands into a bowl of sacred white chalk, using it to mark her forehead. "This is no time for fear," she said. "We have the strength of our ancestors." Her courage ignited the others. One by one, villagers followed her lead, drawing protective symbols across their skin and grabbing whatever weapons they could, spears, staffs, even farming tools. Zalaira, her breath coming in short gasps, clutched a small leather pouch given to her by her grandmother years ago, a charm meant to ward off dark spirits. Oman let out a piercing howl, his form swelling, his voice now layered with something ancient and sinister. "Fools! Do you think your chants and sticks can stop me?" Then he struck. A wave of shadowy tendrils lashed out, slamming into the villagers, sending some flying back. Others barely dodged in time, rolling out of the way. The ground beneath them darkened, as though the very earth had been poisoned by his presence. But Shango did not falter. His chants grew louder, faster, as he raised his staff high. The markings on the wood glowed, pulsing with a golden light. "Omand," the shaman called, his voice booming like a storm. "You are bound by the laws of the spirits. You have broken the sacred balance, and now you will answer for your crimes." Omand hissed, his form twisting violently. "You do not understand, old man." With a furious shriek, he raised his hands and summoned the darkness to his side. The torches lining the village square flickered and died, plunging everything into eerie half-light. The shadows around them came alive, writhing like serpents, coiling toward the villagers. The air grew icy thick with unseen horrors. A deep, guttural rumbling rose from the earth. Dark figures emerged from the shadows, twisted, half-formed creatures with hollow eyes and clawed hands. The villagers cried out, stepping back. They had never seen spirits like these before. The battle had truly begun. Shango planted his staff into the earth, and the symbols he had drawn earlier blazed to life, forming a protective barrier. Some of the spirits shrieked as they touched it, their forms dissolving into black smoke. But others pressed forward, forcing their way into the village. Villagers swung their weapons, striking at the shadows. Their blows landed, but only just. The creatures screeched in pain but did not disappear. Only the sacred chalk and charms seemed to truly harm them. Zelira's mind raced. She had to do something. They could not win through brute force alone. Then she remembered a story. An old tale her grandmother had told her when she was a child. A story of a trickster spirit, one that could not be killed, only outwitted. Her heart pounded. That was it. She turned to Baba Jango. "We can't fight him like this. We have to trick him. We must make him trap himself." The old man's eyes flashed with understanding. "Then we must give him what he desires." Zelira turned to Omand, forcing confidence into her voice. "You claim we cannot stop you," she called out, stepping toward him. "But if you are so powerful, why do you fear the truth?" Omand snarled, his head snapping toward her. "What are you talking about?" "You claim to be a master of deception," Zelira continued, her mind racing. "Then prove it. Face the spirits who gave you your power. If you are truly one of them, they will not harm you." The villagers caught on quickly. "Yes." Baba Jango called. "Stand in the center of the circle, Omand. Let the spirits decide your fate." Omand hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his dark, shifting form. Zelira knew she had him. "Or are you afraid?" she taunted. The trickster let out a furious roar, but pride, his greatest weakness, would not let him back down. With one last, defiant glare, he stepped into the center of the shaman's circle. The moment he did, Shango raised his staff high and slammed it into the earth. The symbols around Omand blazed to life, burning brighter than before. Omand's howl of rage shook the night. He tried to move, to escape, but it was too late. The spirits he had once commanded turned on him. From the darkness, the very entity he had made his pact with appeared. "You have failed your task," the spirit said, its flickering form towering over him. "You have been deceived by a mere mortal." Omand screamed. "No. I am one of you." But the spirit only laughed. "You were only ever a servant, Omand. And now you will pay the price." With a final agonized shriek, Omand's form unraveled, his shadowy essence twisting as it was dragged downward, into the depths of the spirit realm. The earth shook, the sky trembled, and then silence. The darkness lifted. The spirits vanished. The villagers, still shaking, slowly lowered their weapons. The nightmare was over. Zelira, her chest heaving, collapsed to her knees. She had done it. They had done it. Omand was gone. Shango let out a slow breath. He will never return. The villagers gathered, embracing one another, whispering prayers of gratitude. Some wept in relief, others simply stared in awe. Baba Jango placed a hand on Zelira's shoulder. "You saved us all, child. Your wisdom, your courage, it was what we needed most." Zelira looked up, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "He almost had me," she whispered. Mama Ao smiled softly. "But in the end you had him." The village would never forget that night. And neither would Zelira. The morning after the battle, the village stood in solemn silence. The air was heavy, still carrying the echoes of the nightmare they had endured. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the mist, illuminating the scars left behind, the scorched earth where the shaman's ritual had taken place, the broken huts, the villagers huddled together, whispering prayers of gratitude and mourning. Though they had won, the cost of victory was undeniable. Some villagers had been wounded, their bodies bearing the marks of the shadow's wrath. Others had lost livestock and homes, signs of Omand's dark influence. But more than anything, the greatest wound was the betrayal. The man they had welcomed, trusted, and embraced as one of their own had nearly destroyed them all. The elders stood at the center of the village, their faces etched with both grief and wisdom. Baba Jango, the oldest among them, raised his staff, signaling for silence. The villagers turned their attention toward him, awaiting his words. "This night will not be forgotten," he said, his voice steady but heavy with sorrow. "We have faced the darkness and emerged stronger. But let this serve as a reminder, evil does not always arrive with fangs and claws. Sometimes it comes wearing a smile." Murmurs spread through the crowd as the weight of his words settled in. Many glanced at Zalaira, who stood near the shaman, her arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes, once bright with dreams of love and adventure, now held a quiet wisdom. She had trusted Omand, had believed in his charm and kind words. She had ignored the warnings, dismissed the unease. And in doing so she had nearly lost everything. But she had also learned. With a deep breath, Zalaira stepped forward. "I was blind," she admitted, her voice raw but resolute. "I ignored what my heart whispered to me. I believed what I wanted to believe rather than what was true. And for that I put us all in danger." A few villagers lowered their heads, remembering how they too had been fooled. Omand's lies had not only deceived Zalaira but the entire community. "But we must not let this fear define us," Zalaira continued. "We must learn from it. We must remember that true strength is not just in the body, but in the mind and the spirit. And most of all, we must listen, to our elders, to our instincts, to the voices that caution us, even when we don't want to hear them." Shango, the shaman, nodded approvingly. "The spirits do not always speak in loud voices," he said. "Sometimes they whisper. And it is our duty to listen." The villagers began to murmur again, this time not in fear but in understanding. They had always known the stories, tales of tricksters, spirits, and deceitful beings who preyed on the trusting. But now they had lived one of their own. Mama Ao stepped forward, carrying a bowl of white chalk. One by one, she began marking the foreheads of the villagers, a symbol of protection, of remembrance. "From this day forward," she said, "we will honor this lesson. We will teach it to our children and they to theirs. So that never again will we be so easily deceived." A small group of children, who had watched the events unfold from the safety of their homes, whispered among themselves. One of them, a wide-eyed girl named Keone, tugged on Zalaira's arm. "Will you tell us the story?" she asked softly. Zalaira looked down at the child, surprised. "The story?" Keone nodded. "The story of the woman who outwitted the trickster. So we will never forget." Zalaira felt a lump form in her throat. She knelt before Keone, brushing a hand over the girl's braided hair. "Yes," she said. "I will tell you. And you will tell others. And one day when danger comes again, you will remember what to do." As the sun climbed higher, the villagers began the long process of rebuilding. Men and women worked side by side, repairing the damage left in the battle's wake. The laughter of children returned, cautious at first, but growing stronger with each passing hour. And Zalaira? She too had a choice to make. For the first time in her life, she realized that her path was not tied to another person. She had spent so long dreaming of love, of adventure, of being swept away by something larger than herself. But now she saw that she was capable of creating her own destiny. No longer would she seek validation in the arms of another. She would seek it in herself. One evening, as the village gathered around a fire, Zalaira sat among them, her voice steady as she began to speak. "This is the story of a woman who trusted too quickly," she said, "and a trickster who thought himself invincible. But in the end, wisdom and courage won the day." The children leaned in, eager to listen. The elders nodded approvingly. And so, the story of Omand the trickster and Zalaira, the woman who defied him, became legend. A lesson for generations to come. And with each telling, Zalaira grew stronger, wiser. She had trusted the wrong man. But in the end she had found herself.